Hello, and welcome to the So Emotional podcast. Here on the cast, we discuss everything emotions through the lens of attachment, the nervous system, and internal parts work. We're a little irreverent and like to have fun exploring the emotional issues and dynamics that interest us. So come along and hang out. Let's explore the fascinating lands of emotions.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the So Emotional podcast. I am Angela Wetzel, founder of Epic Initiator Coaching. This here is Nick Carl. He is also your host and messing with his microphone.
I hit it.
He is the founder / person behind the Safe Anchor, providing somatic experience support to people all over the world, soon to be. And today we're going to talk about enmeshment and parentification.
Cool.
Really juicy topic. Actually, something that I know very well because I would identify as a parentified child and had a very enmeshed dynamic with my mother. And it's interesting, like growing up that way, I really just thought of my mother as like my best friend, kind of, in a lot of ways. And I didn't really realize things were unhealthy. I just thought we were very close. I think until I probably got into my late 20s and started to do more research and learn a lot more about psychology and how boundaries are supposed to work. And then, of course, by that time, I was learning about things in my childhood that so I started to realize why I was seeing certain relationship dynamics show up and all the things. So basically all the worms came out of the can.
I want to talk a little bit first about just the basics. So you mentioned the word enmeshment. So we are talking about a bonding attachment. So in a healthy, in a healthy working attachment, there's a lot of things and a lot of boundaries that need to be in place for somebody to be what we consider to be securely attached, which is secure in of themselves, believe themselves to be a healthy and thriving person on their own, living in the universe, right? And if that is if that mold is a little bit lumpy or something, there's just like some inconsistencies or some places that were not held up, then they happen in certain patterns. And this is one of the patterns that happens, which we call enmeshment, right? So this is your relationship as a child with your primary bond person, and normally, a lot of the times it happens primarily with your mother, right? That's how it happens, though it doesn't have to happen that way. So that's what you're talking about. You're talking about some of the relationship dynamics that you or that people experience with their primary person.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say quickly that secure attachment is really being able to move in and out of relationships with ease. Like you have a lot of self-trust when you're by yourself. Mm-hmm. You have a lot of trust when you're with people. Your nervous system, you're able to be well regulated and be in a calm, happy, connected state.
Right.
So you flow in and out of relationships, ideally.
Right.
And when it comes to enmeshment, it really just means that it's a relationship that is that lacks boundaries in a lot of ways. It can be very close in a way that's actually damaging, meaning people can't really tell the difference between themselves and another emotion. Like if someone starts to become emotional, they become emotional. So it's almost like where one person ends, you can't always tell where the other one begins and like what belongs to whom. So it can be very confusing as to what you're allowed to have, what opinions you're allowed to have, what you're allowed to feel. It all becomes very much like two people sort of operating as one person in a way where it's like what's yours is mine and what's mine is yours.
Right.
And so that can show up in a lot of different relationship dynamics, but it can be your mother, it can be your father, it could really be almost anyone. It can be a romantic partner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some of the hallmarks of enmeshment? Like what are some of the actual
I would say like over identification with another person's emotions. So feeling completely responsible for another person's emotions, or if they're having
Okay.
emotions, then you're feeling like you're having
Yeah.
those same emotions, or
Right.
being like, oh my God, I did that. Right.
Yeah.
Um,
For my whole life, especially with women, right? When anything would happen, when there was any kind of emotions, my go-to thing, which I put together later, is like, what did I do? Right? That was the
right.
exact first thing that I would
Yeah.
think, that it
So
had
it
something to
can,
do with me.
so it can be this really feeling responsible for the other person's emotions, like thinking that's your job. It can also be like the lack of boundaries means that at different levels, like you have a parent that is oversharing parts of the relationship, like with their parent. So it
Right.
can become this like triangulation where,
You're my little
um,
person that I talk to about my spouse and share
right.
details that a child should never hear, you know.
Exactly. And so it becomes like the child becomes the confidant. Perhaps the one parent is like the bad guy or the aggressor, the perpetrator,
Right.
and like the mother is like maybe the martyr. And so like the child in some way is like the rescuer, or is like somehow keeping the one parent safe, and then that parent is confiding in the child, and the child is helping them emotionally helping them emotionally, like listening to stories, like just engaging on an emotional level that's beyond that.
Mm.
um and then it's like it can show up as like the parent kind of being very controlling around a child, and transgressing their personal, their physical boundaries, like telling them what to wear, um controlling who their friends are, like controlling all aspects of their lives. It can be, it's really just a lot of overstepping of the boundaries. And so the child, like, thinking that they can't have their own opinions, um, their own right to like how they feel or how they want things done, or what, um, yeah, just like basically their own yes, their own no. Like it's
Right.
generally not respected.
I can remember, it's not recently, but I can remember being around like friends who had children, you know, and watching them engage the child for a decision, right? Which I remember, like, I can remember seeing, like, why would you ever do that? You know, like, why would you, you know, like it didn't make sense to my brain. Now it makes more sense to my brain, you know, because I start to like retell this story of almost like the parent figure that I almost wish that I had, you know, and it kind of turns into this like the idea of this. It does feel a little bit one up, which I think is, I guess it's okay with a attachment parent figure, you know, but they get to be. It's like you don't have to take care of them ever, right? Like
Yeah.
I can imagine like when you get older, you know, maybe your parent, because like there's definitely a time as a child where you will actually treat your parents like shit, you know, and do mean things to them. I can imagine doing that, and about how like as an adult parent, like you'd have to like set a boundary and be like, I don't tolerate that, you know.
Mhm.
But that's a sort of a different kind of boundary. But you know, I know a lot in like my own household. It was sort of like, where was the gravitational center, emotional center of the household, right? And it was mom's gravitational center, you know, and depending on how she felt, you know, you just sort of like bobbed and weaved and kept an ear out all the time for like a change in the mood of her voice, you know, because that's when you knew like how it was going to go. And
Mm.
it didn't, which all seemed normal at the time, you know, but yes, it sort of can set you up for real issues down the line. So
Yeah.
if you are, let's just say, so this is parentification. So if you are parentified as a child in different ways, don't have these great boundaries. Does that immediately put you into having an insecure attachment style? Does that sort of lead to that? I know it has to be a contributing factor, but
I would say yes, definitely.
right. And then is that more avoidant or is it more anxious?
I would put that immediately into disorganized.
Okay. So like we got both going on depending on the
But
situation.
that's because I believe that parentification and enmeshment set up really complicated dynamics, which one of those is if I'm the child and I'm supposed to get regulation from an adult, I'm supposed to learn how to regulate myself from an adult. In the absence of a regulated adult, I now have to step into the role of like adult and caretake an adult. Then it's kind of like if that person, if my parent doesn't feel safe in this world and doesn't know what the fuck is going on, what am I doing? What are my odds of survival? Like what are my odds of succeeding at this where they failed? It's almost like you just have to step into that role and somehow figure it out.
Right.
So it's a complete sacrificing of your own needs to take care of someone else when the dynamic is supposed to be completely reversed.
Yeah.
So
So maybe there would be some times where you would you'd you'd feel no choice and then be thrust into that role, or maybe you could animate that even okay for a little while, right?
right. And but this is the thing, like from what I remember, it just so happened to be like my personality. I think it had to do with the birth order. I think it had to do with just the timing of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, I feel like it was kind of helpful because I feel like my other siblings sort of dodged a bullet
Mm.
and maybe had a better experience because I
Right.
took on a lot of the burden. Like
Right.
I would have called it like throwing myself on the grenade,
Sure.
but I already had that aspect like in my personality of being extremely empathic, very compassionate, noticing my parents, noticing all their moods, all their behavior, like
Right.
noticing the unhappiness there. And something that um it's called when you have a parent like emotionally dumping on you, or it's like they, let's say, in this society, families can become, the nuclear families become very isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you have that other parent that's supposed to be there is either not present, or let's say in this case like is more of an aggressor type, then the parent is going to like that parent that's remaining, perhaps now like acting as like a single parent, is going to want support or like need support but maybe not have a lot of resources, and this kind of stuff doesn't really happen like consciously, it just happens.
Right.
And so that kind of emotional sharing, when it's coming from an adult level to a child, is known as emotional incest.
Right.
So when you think about incest, what that is like inside of the family, there's those like inappropriate boundary crossings, mostly known in like the sexual way.
Right.
But in the emotional way, it's still an appropriate burden that's being placed on the child emotionally from another level that they don't have the emotional maturity or growth level to really understand. And it ends up being like a major intimacy wound
Right.
because it's and I believe that creates part of an avoidant aspect.
Mm.
But then the enmeshment, like there's something about that bond that feels so, it's like a trauma bond, so it's
Sure.
very strong,
Mm-hmm.
that connection. And I believe it becomes this push pull situation, which is why I would say it's more disorganized.
Yeah.
um in that if that parent like goes away and is gone and just leaves and doesn't mention where they're going, or that parent, let's say, has felt like they have that stable emotional base and then they go off and do their thing, when that child doesn't have their own identity based on like being able to separate themselves and individuate, when that parent is gone, it's like how do they regulate when they get all of their value and worth from
Yeah.
from
Being a
rescuing
support system.
this
Yeah.
parent, right?
Right.
So it doesn't always um I think show up like, I think this actually happens a lot,
Sure.
a lot. And like a lot of the clients that I work with are, I would say, in the very least, disorganized and commonly fearful avoidant. But I do see a lot of this in the consults that I do, the people that I speak to and encounter, even on Instagram, like in my inbox, just different people talking about what they've been through. And this can show up in so many different ways. It can show up as, if you have a parent that's actually ill or has been hurt and you end up taking care of that parent for the sake of the family, it can happen that way. Like I said, a lot of it isn't really conscious, and sometimes it's just how things work out. You could have another parent that passes away, so then you're left with one parent and they need help with the house.
Right.
It can happen if you have a parent that's an addict. So there's just so many different versions of this that can happen, or how that happens.
Right.
And in some ways, like, it can feel really good to feel like you're special, to feel like you're needed,
Right.
to be mom's little angel or daddy's little girl, something about it.
Right.
But in other ways, it can be extremely damaging for future relationships, because then for that lens of intimacy, like that kind of closeness is conflated with that feeling of emotional overwhelm and potentially being helpless to actually help that parent or help themselves. And then there's so many other issues that can come from it, like not really being able to know or understand your own feelings, not be able to get support,
Right.
like being emotionally numb or dissociated, or having, because of the push pull, wanting the affection, intimacy, and closeness, but also feeling the rage of feeling trapped in that place of obligation.
Right.
So it can definitely be like a love-hate situation.
Hmm. I remember a friend of mine had sent me some stuff about, it was on some talk show, and they were talking about empaths, like as adults, and then somebody made the point that, no, there's no such thing as empaths. These are just parentified children. Because if you're sort of stuck in that, uh, this reminds me of something else I thought about 1 minute ago, which is whatever happens to a child when it happens when you're a child, you just internalize it as something with you that happens to you. And I'm not saying it right, but like, so turning into an empath, like, it's like here you are set into this environment where you have to be attuned, right?
I think,
Because one of the, yeah, go ahead.
well, there's two things. So actually, like, being a highly sensitive person is biological. So there's a
Right.
number of genetic mutations that occur, that are based on like how neurotransmitters are created,
Okay.
and like the amount of the amount of mirror neurons and nerve
Sure.
endings in the body. So that's one thing that's biological.
Right.
So HSPs, like highly sensitive people, do exist.
Right.
But I firmly believe that a lot of that comes from the signals that are coming like through the
The
mother,
nurture.
as
Right.
well as the child is in like incubation, like
Hmm.
gestating, due to
Oh,
the hormones that are coming through. So if the mother is under a lot of stress, like cortisol and like epinephrine,
oh shit.
norepinephrine are
It's
flooding
like we're
into,
gonna need to fire up all these
right.
genes for you to be like on your fucking toes, because guess what? You're already getting the
There's
signals that the place you're coming into is hostile.
Right. In some way, danger, danger, danger. You're going to need extra sensitivity to survive. So,
Right.
and I believe there's research out there to support it. But if you read, like, It Didn't Start With You, or you look at some of the research that they've done over the years of like
Right.
genetic, epigenetics and genetic markings and stuff like that.
I've
So
been
that's
listening
part of it.
to
But I
I've been
also
listening to
agree.
some of the Gabor Mate because he's got a new book out, and he's mentioned in a few of the podcasts that he's done lately that like mental illness is not a disease, right? So there, like he talked about, there's no so like but he talked about the sensitivity, right? That there are genetic markers for sensitivity. So that's what you normally have is highly sensitive children who are then sort of like nurtured in these type of ways that then develop these, coping mechanisms is what these all are. These are
Mhm.
ways to stay safe, because that's one of the things that's on the line when you are a, child put in that position. It's like, well, here's your person. who feeds you the manna of love and connection. And so you don't have any choice but to sort of do what is sort of like asked of you to do, right? Which is in this case, like be a confidant, right? Or be somebody who's attendant to the emotions of your person because you need that person. Without that person, you die. So,
Right. So
right,
you can help them be safe so that you can be safe, because
right.
that's the only way.
Okay, so you fast forward into adulthood, and now you are highly attuned to everything moving around you all the time. Like I kind of imagine somebody who's classically anxious. Now I know that this goes both ways, and then there can be avoidant aspects of it too. But I just think about in my own being, for instance, it was just like like I said, especially with women, right? Because I think that's where it was all honed, uh, of just like whatever happens, like like, oh, what did I do? What did I do? Like, oh my god, did I say something? Did I do something? And it's like, no, Jesus fucking Christ, no, you didn't, dude. Calm down. And it's like it's taken me a long time to be like, oh my god, I hung out with a friend just the other day, and I'm like I left the restaurant, and I just like had all these like deep emotional reactions. So it's just like the um the foundational things of enmeshment, right? Of parentification, like I think they're pretty deep, and
Yeah.
they are hard to sort of like excavate and to see the whole landscape of how this was all set up. So I know that it's some powerful shit.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but to that point, I
Yeah.
wanted to say that I do believe that being an empath is both nature
Right.
to some degree because of that, those signals that are sent to the fetus in development, and then also based on the environment that
Mm-hmm.
they grow up in, and just maybe some like personality aspects too, of like introversion, extroversion. But
So emotional investment and parentification is it the same thing?
I mean, I don't know that they are exactly always the same thing, but here's the thing. In order to, if you have no boundaries
Mm-hmm.
between a parent and a child, then we already know that that's more of a child, like those child parts of that parent, I'm using air quotes for parent,
Okay.
are the one like kind of driving that ship. So there's not any consciousness there. So it's kind of like having a child raising a child. So then it's like if that parent, like maybe let's say that parent is showing up in certain ways and they have some healthy behaviors for modeling, like
Mm-hmm.
they have a job, they're able to socialize, like so they
Right.
have like certain functional
Mm-hmm.
adult things, but perhaps emotionally they're completely a child, and so their child takes over and becomes the parent in that situation. So it's
Right.
like it's like the dynamics are a bit confused because they're in the adult body doing adult things, and then in other areas where they're meant to be the emotional leader, they become incapacitated due
Right.
to whatever life circumstance, whether it's an abusive household, whether it's substance addiction, or what's called mental illness, which is really just loads and loads of trauma
Right.
usually.
Yeah.
um
Bipolar disorder, anxiety
yeah
disorder, all
so
the yeah.
yeah, so I would say pretty much that those two like go together, just because yeah, because it's kind of like, well, who's the parent if there's no parent, really?
Right. Right.
If the parent is an emotional child because of their own lineage and everything that they've inherited and all the trauma they've inherited,
Right.
you have a child that's now had a child. And
Mm-hmm.
if that parent is running around triggered all the time and is dysregulated, then
Right.
that child is going to do their best to step up and pretzel themselves and do whatever they can to establish equilibrium in the family. So
Mm.
that's a natural thing. Like children will naturally psychologically self sacrifice to save the family dynamic.
Sure. Sure.
And they do so without thought or without hesitation
Right.
because
It's
it's just what needs to be done. It's the same thing. I believe when these aspects of our parts show up, it's like the energy shows up to do what must be done
mm-hmm.
because there's no other choice.
Right.
Or at least that's,
Yeah.
the thought at the time.
So I didn't think about that. So it's the parents too are showing up in that way that they are because they are triggered, and it's their own trauma that's putting them in that place, which is then, and this is how lineage is built, right? So it's the not being able to regulate, having their own trauma and their trauma patterns actually come up in relationship with their own children, and here it is. It gets sort of like downloaded in a way.
Right. Well, it's sort of just like, let's say it's happening in life. For example, in my situation, my dad at that time when I was younger was more of an aggressor.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he would be classified as like a rageaholic or addicted to rage, I guess, which, I think is a confusing term anyway to begin
Right.
with. But so I remember in my younger years finding my mom like crying in her room. And
Mm-hmm.
she would say, I'm a good person, aren't I? Like, what have I done to deserve this? I don't
Right.
understand. And so naturally, like, I would see her pain and I would be like, yes, of course you're a good person. Like, yeah, you don't deserve that.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I would just do whatever I could to like make her feel better. But I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't doing it from a place of manipulation. Like, I truly believed that my mom was a good person. And I do believe she's a good person
Right.
even now. But she wasn't understanding why some of these dynamics were showing up in her married life because she didn't experience that growing up. But my grandmother experienced something very similar. So it almost
Oh.
skipped a generation.
Or the way that it reciprocates. It was in your grandma's generation, then it reciprocated to the other end of the pendulum, and then here it comes back into your mother's.
Right. So and also at the time that my grandmother was witnessing that as a child, so my grandmother witnessed her father, so that would have been my great grandfather,
Hmm.
physically abusing very badly her brothers, but never touched her. But at that time, my mother would have been just an egg living
Yeah.
inside of her. And it's like, if everything is energy, which is kind of trippy to think about,
Yeah.
then you'd have to think about all of these messages that go to the different parts of our body and are informing things,
Right.
including genetic coding.
Right.
So it's, and that's spoken about where it's like generationally, if you have a fetus that's inside of a woman, you have 3 generations inside. Because
Right.
then that fetus, that female will have all the eggs she'll ever
Right.
have, right?
Yeah.
So it's like really wild to think about that.
I mean, it sounds pretty fucking woo, but these are like dynamics that I don't think really. I mean, how could you put that together? Like, I thought about this. Like, we had a family reunion recently, and I was just like, I don't really want to do the family reunion things. The thought I had was like, how about we have a presentation? Everybody gets up and tells stories. It would be these types of dynamics. Like, what type of person was he? Even my own grandfather. Like, it's like I kind of know what kind of person he was, but not really. It's like, what were the actual, emotional dynamics of my own family? Even in my own family, I don't really know the story. And so, though it sounds crazy to think that, like, kind of what we're talking about, like it goes from here to here to here. Well, it's like, well, if we actually had that information, maybe we could actually tell the story in a manner that would, be
Right.
like, holy shit, this is actually real.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the family tree, and what I started to do was put together the like matriculations of the original traumas that I knew about
Right.
from my parents' parents.
Mm-hmm.
So then I started to see how the dynamics were set up, like how my parents fit together,
Right.
and also looking at their siblings and the marriages and the divorces and just the different, like if there were substance addictions, if this, aunt married someone who was like gambling addict and out. So I'm
Right.
looking at all of the dysfunction. on both sides
Mm-hmm.
because, the saying goes, shit rolls downhill.
Yes.
And also, I know it does sound really woo, but it's really fascinating because reading the book "It Didn't Start with You" by Mark Wolin,
Yeah.
he talks about that, and a lot of people know about this experiment by now.
Excuse
But is that a burp
me.
like
Yeah.
into the air, like you're
Just
howling?
getting away from the microphone. Mark
Oh,
Wolin. Sorry.
yes. So, I'm sorry, I just the
Oh.
image of you like howling at the moon. It's like a burp. So this experiment that they did with mice,
Oh
and
yeah.
they had the bottom of this cage fit with an electrical grid,
Yes.
and they wafted in a certain chemical, and I never remember what exactly that chemical
Right.
was, but it smells like cherry blossoms. And so they wafted in that chemical, and then they they electrified the bottom of the cage so that
Right.
it would shock their feet
Yeah.
with like a pretty good charge.
Yes.
So then I don't know, I think they just did that once. I don't know if they did it more than once,
Yeah.
but they bred those mice, and then their offspring they put in a cage.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't even electrify the bottom, whatever, but they were monitoring their nervous system response.
Right.
They wafted in the scent of cherry blossoms, and they
Yes.
reacted just like they were about to be shocked. Like
Yeah.
their nervous systems were anticipating that
Right.
shock. So
So
that tells me that when we have unresolved trauma in our bodies, that we're subconsciously already going to be teaching our children, like
right.
behaviorally, to anticipate how to respond, whether you speak up, whether you avert your eyes, whether you hide, whether you fight, whether you flee, whether you fawn, like all these different things that aren't really taught explicitly. They're just implicit. They're
Right.
not spoken about, but it's
Yes.
learned because children operate
Implicit memory.
primarily
Right.
in theta waves. So they just absorb. So they're
Right.
always watching the interactions, the different dynamics going on.
Well, it's just like whatever dimension, be it genes or something else that information exists on, right? That got passed from that generation of mice that exist. I heard about that somewhere else too. It's called like the 100th monkey system, but it was another testing they did with mice. I
Right.
read about this a while ago, and it was about, I think it was maze testing. They were testing in mazes, and they had I can't remember exactly the story, but they were testing with these mice, and then they got better and better and better. But then all of a sudden, like they were all good everywhere, you know. And so, and there was different researchers doing it at the same time. So it's like the mice weren't talking, you know, but some kind of field of information was being passed that they couldn't account for really. And so it's like, okay,
Right.
what the fuck is that, right?
Very
So
interesting.
it's it's like, what is it? Not sure. Does it really matter? Probably not exactly how it is. It'd be cool to actually know what the actual mechanism was. But the thing to like really grok or get into is that, like, yes, there is things that are passed through your families and through your relationships that are very deep to how you understand the world to be, right?
Yeah.
So
And
when you yeah, go ahead.
oh, well, they've also like they have found that these things are carried. Well, I think specifically they have more evidence that things are carried on the Y chromosome, but now they're finding more evidence that it's this information is being carried on the X chromosome, so that it's actually being carried on in the genes.
Sure. So when you first mentioned this topic, emotional enmeshment, which is this is close, it's just a slightly different angle. I thought about uh, my own internal emotional enmeshment, right? And so what I and how I sort of would describe that would be something would happen in my life. I would be in some sort of place, and then I would have a strong emotional reaction to something. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess forever, I just thought whatever emotion that I'm having is me. That's who I am, right?
Mm,
So I'm just like, that's just it is what it is. If it's happening, then that's me, right? It wasn't until it really was when I started doing like somatic work, somatic work, and it happened very quickly. It happened in a matter of about 30 minutes, but it was honestly that I was like brought into my body, and then I sort of got to witness how much emotional energy was there. Long story short, it was a lot, not a little. It was a lot. It was a boatload. It was an ocean load, and it was like, holy shit, right? And
Mm.
then kind of, I guess, you know, I had read it in several books, and kind of like think about it, but it was very much a aha moment that the all the emotional energy that I finally began to experience in my own body came from old stuff. Now I couldn't tell exactly how old it was. But here it is. So I kind of like separate out the layers of the sandwich of my own being. Is like I have my thoughts. I can think whatever I want to, right? I can do whatever I want in my mind. And then
Mm.
I have, of course, my body and the world's happening out here, and then also my emotions that flow through. And I didn't ever think about my emotions that flowed through me or like being triggered as a separate thing, right? And so
Right.
that's the
Mhm.
enmeshment part that I first thought about when we thought about this. So it's like I usually attributed it to like, oh, if I feel something strong, I could usually point at a situation or a person and be like, well, you did this. This is because something you're doing, which is classic projection, right? Like, this is your fault. I'm just being normal and feeling these things, but it's because of this, that. And I would always point out there somewhere.
Yeah.
But it takes some, which is part of the work of what like somatic experiencing does. It takes some work to be able to stay in your seat of like awareness and watch the things pass through. Because as triggers come up, so triggers and trauma, we start to get into the conversation about what those are and how they actually present.
Mhm.
And so the way I kind of think about it is like these are deep ideas about how we sit in the world, and they can be activated by things that happen in the world. They can be activated by reflections or projections, and then they can just they can do it just on their own too. They can just come and present. And so previous to working with it and sitting with it, so as like now when things come up, and I still to this very day today have strong emotions that cycle through me, and they will start certain thought patterns happening. But I kind of just watch them because I know that if I just like watch them and be with them and try to be curious and compassionate, that's just the attitude that I try to take with it, that in a matter of time it will be gone, right?
Mhm.
Which is very interesting. So it's like I can be I can be here feeling a certain way, be very upset when the thing is sort of happening, and then over here a little bit later it's just gone.
Yeah.
And so and it can happen. It's just strange watching the patterns of how it actually happens out in life, and starting to see that like, holy shit. So this is some of my deep realizations was like, holy shit, I have been enmeshed my entire life, my entire life. And so that the way that I saw the world was really through these lenses, these child lenses, right? Because I assume all this comes from either like deep lineages of family or my own personal childhood, right? And so it's a particular point of view, or like it is a particular point of view of seeing it through and feeling it through and seeing the world through this lens of the trigger of the trauma. And when it comes up, it really has a lot of energy there. It can because it grabs a hold of your thoughts, absolutely. It'll grab a hold of your body, absolutely. It will move all your emotions, and really insist that what you're seeing in front of you is X, right? This
Yes.
person is being an asshole, like whatever is happening. It's like, so all of the possibilities of the world get collapsed into this is happening. And it's usually a pretty charged, like, fighting or sad or whatever the emotion is. And
Mhm.
forever, my enmeshment was just believing that story because there is like a story component to it, right?
Mhm.
Right. So that's the enmeshment that I sort of thought about. But you can think about it. That's what's happening, say, to your mother, right? there she is crying in her bedroom, fully triggered, like, how did this happen to me? Why am I here? Aren't I a good person? All of these deep wounds are activated inside of her, telling her the story from her past, wherever it comes from, her own life or her own family, activating this thing, and she is believing it. Her consciousness is believing it, and it's fully taken over her being, right? And then, you have the fortune to interact with her then, to come into her then, and so, there's like the enmeshment that happens there, but I don't know. So that's what I thought about, and I just think that the way that that happens and the distinction of being able to see that it's a completely different subsystem of information, because like a trigger is like it comes from our subconscious, and we're talking about information that exists in places that's, like
Right.
people think that it's stored in the body, right? Or wherever it is stored, but it's not stored
Yeah.
in our, we don't have direct access to like, why is it here? Why am I
Mm-hmm.
feeling this way? Where did this come from? How did this begin? That it doesn't come with that information. It just comes into our beings and sort of almost like a ghost, like holds us, interacts with us, animates us, And to me, and that's super fascinating about like where it comes from and how, because we have habitually done it really throughout our whole lives, to us who have a certain degree of this happening, our wounds coming up, uh, affecting how we see our lives, and then really painting our lenses.
Yeah, I just some thoughts that were coming up as you were speaking was just about the amount of information that we're taking in at every moment, especially those
Right.
that are highly sensitive. Like so many different layers of things
Yeah.
happening at the same time.
Yeah. There's a
Like,
shit ton happening
right.
all the time. You know how many moments there are? There's
Yeah.
thousands of moments every day.
So they say that our human brain actually holds somewhere in the range of at least terabytes of information, but it's
Sure.
like if you consider it's like 3D, but it's including all of our senses. So
Mm-hmm.
you can pick up on a sense or you're like subconsciously, like below your level of awareness. Potentially, you can pick up on body language, like subtle gestures, eye movements, like musculoskeletal, like
The sound of a
facial things,
voice.
sound of
Yeah.
a voice, the way something is said, and like
Right. The
you
way
can be
something
triggered.
smells. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. You can be triggered externally and not even know what it was. It could be
Right.
the way that like the light refracted off of something
Right.
that reminded you of some moment.
So,
And then you can also become internally triggered just by feeling a feeling and being
or
like, oh,
thinking about something.
or
Right.
thinking a thought and then be like, oh shit. So,
Right.
like, and I believe that everyone is triggered many times a day
Oh
by
yeah.
many different things.
Right.
Um, but the other thing that I was thinking about also is like, you know, the books like Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, where they talk about trauma being held like inside the body in the
Like
in the
actually in the
fascia.
fascia. Right.
Yeah, and there being important things like trauma releasing exercises by Dr. David Berceli. Like he talks about myofascial release and
Right.
neurogenic tremoring, because as human animals, like we, because we're so societally like conditioned that instead of like shaking after we've had like a traumatic event to dispel and to dispel that extra energy or to start to change the hormones to release that extra energy, we'll like hold it and then
Mm.
those become held
Right.
patterns like in
Right.
our bodies. So it's really fascinating to think about all that. And then on top of that, the other thing I was thinking was that the like internal enmeshment I think is a pretty interesting concept to think about it that way, to be like enmeshed with your parts in such a way where there's no boundaries, there's no accountability. It's kind of like Lord of the Flies, like there's no emotional
Yeah.
leader, right? And but it makes me think like that is sort of an introjection. Like if we're not taught consciousness or observer consciousness in some way by our parents, then it's like we'll have no idea that we have all these emotional things and like
Right.
We won't really know like how to, I guess, like identify like who we really are, like our real selves,
Mm-hmm.
separate from our trauma. And so it's like our external relationships, like we interject, we take those in, and we end up treating ourselves how we were treated, or kind of taking in those similar dynamics,
Hmm.
because we are a product of our environments and a product of that modeling which we
Right.
saw. So that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
um but I was just also thinking about enmeshment, just also like in romantic relationships, or how people can think of relationships as like always needing to be together, always needing to be joined at the hip. Like everyone has to agree on the same thing and go everywhere together. And if you disagree with that, then like, people being very upset, or even feeling a lot of shame or guilt about wanting to be on your own and doing your own thing, and trying to like always get approval from other people, like performing and just being like, hey, what do you want? Like, how can I make you feel better? And like, that's an aspect of feeling responsible for other people. And just the over, I think, well, something else that I noticed, and I don't know if this was particular to me and my relationship with my mother, but I did notice that she would go through my stuff sometimes as a teenager, and like be in my room and be like, what's this? What's this? And I'm like, why are you in my room? Like,
Yeah.
why are you in my things? And I don't know if she did that to my other siblings, but it almost felt like there was a strange sense of jealousy around where I spent and how I spent my time. So if I was spending time with like my friends and leaving the house a lot, she was always questioning where I was going or what I was doing, or why don't you want to stay here and do this? And I'm just, because like, I don't, like, this isn't the party house, mom. Like, this
Yeah.
isn't, like, this isn't where fun is. This is where like my friends get yelled at for wanting to have a ham sandwich or something. Like, so no, I'm not going to bring my friends over. But it was just like this lack of privacy, and just kind of controlling behaviors, like certain jealousies. It even felt like at times when I was in relationship, it almost feels like at times my mom felt happier that I was single as well when she was single,
Hmm.
so that she didn't feel alone. And there were just certain dynamics that to me felt very unhealthy and very strange. Like, this isn't necessarily how I imagine like a
Right.
healthy bond being between a
Right.
parent and a child.
So it makes me think that we talk about being triggered. And usually, first thing that comes to my mind is like some kind of hard, deep, negative emotion, right? But it sounds like they can be. What is? I think it can be true that they don't have to be that way. Like I don't know. I'm just like, getting a sense of like your mother having that kind of behavior, and like some of it is kind of like sly. It's just like a little bit different. Like I just mean the energy of like what would drag, what would possess her to like go into your. I think about like what's actually possessing her to like go through your stuff, right? I
Mm-hmm.
assume that that too is motivated by a trauma trigger, right?
Right. Well, and I think this is what people under or commonly mistake like triggers. Like, you can have very tiny, minute triggers. Like, think
Right.
about a little tiny
Right.
earthquake. You don't even
Right.
feel it. And that you can have a trigger, and you can have a bunch of those, and then before you know it, you can check in and be like, oh, I'm way down here. What happened? It was a bunch of little things, just like chink, chink, chink in the armor kind of
Yeah.
thing. And they say that like this can be really problematic, especially for like addicts or people that are trying to heal, because they'll kind of not have the experience with being attuned to the subtle shifts in their energy,
Hmm.
because they won't be entirely conscious of some of the thoughts or some of the
Right.
changes in their emotional environment, just based on, because these things that happen are so small.
Right.
But when you add them up, you end up way down the emotional ladder, and then
Right.
you're into this like yellow or red zone. And I
Yeah.
think it's a lot of things like that where you can have small triggers and responses,
Yeah.
and then like not really realize you're operating from
Okay. Well,
there.
this gets into kind of a gray zone then, because it's like, okay, if we have these little sort of like we'll call them micro triggers, but I like to think about this thing as the deep triggers. It's like, okay, this deep trigger happens. Here's this piece of information, right, that comes into your being and kind of takes hold, right? But it's like I think about this big dark thing, but shit, it could be happening all the time, right? It'd just be
Mhm.
like trigger to trigger to trigger to trigger to trigger. So I think about what is the delineation between living through trigger versus living through creation or consciousness,
Mhm.
creative consciousness. And it's like, I wonder what some of the hallmarks of consciousness, like creative consciousness, are.
I mean, I would say one, just being aware of the triggers. So if you are able to stay in that place of awareness, you'll actually know when you're triggered.
Right.
Like you will know, like you'll be observing, like you were talking about, like walking and observing yourself, observing the thoughts when you're in that witness place and you're seeing things, then
Mm-hmm.
you have access, you're like in your prefrontal cortex. And when you're
Right.
there, you have a shot at choosing a different neural pathway or a different behavior.
Right.
And that's actually free will. The only time you're in free will is when you're in that place of awareness.
Right.
So it's like feeling the impulse, like your trigger is going to give you an impulse to do something, fight, flight,
Mm-hmm.
flee, fawn,
Right.
like go get the plate of brownies, like go distract, like go,
Yeah.
get on Hinge, whatever it is,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
right? And if you're able to hold yourself inside of that impulse and notice what the trigger wants you to do,
Right.
because I always say, like, if you have a trigger, notice where it's pulling, you're pulling back, meaning
Mm-hmm.
like you're going into the past.
Right.
But the bullet, it's like you're pulling back to the past and the bullet's going out, and it's like where you focus is where that bullet's going,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like you're creating from all this like past influence.
Right.
um
And I know that like that's one of the things I have developed as I've started like intently paying attention to my own stuff is like, I can kind of get this gut shot thing of like, wait, what am I doing right now? Like, where's this coming from? Is it, am I doing something new? Am I doing something free? You start to get the sense of like what actually being creative is, or like, is this old shit? Because spoiler alert, right?
yeah,
Most of it's fucking old shit. It's
yeah,
just like,
just
oh, I'm doing it
repeated.
again, right? And so it's,
It's
yeah,
like leftovers that mom
yeah,
just makes into different meals, but you're like, I know this is the
right.
same shit
Yeah, because I'm like, once you
that
develop the smell for it, and it's just like, oh, okay, okay. And I don't have like the perfect like solution for every time that happens, but I know that noticing and being conscious of it, I like that. Well, that's the first place, right? And I can keep doing all the things the practices that I try to employ to, give myself the opportunity for something new. Just because, I turned 42 today. It's like
Oh,
I
yeah.
know all the old shit. I
Happy
know all.
birthday.
Thank you. But I know it's like I know all the old stuff, and I know what it gets me, right? And I know what that world looks like. So like I'm like hopeful and like looking to ask for something else. So
Hmm.
cool.
Yeah, I was just thinking of other, so like, well, this is the interesting thing too. So I did not realize I had this enmeshed, very codependent relationship, right, with my mother. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know that there were unhealthy dynamics. I suspected like everything wasn't like super great, but I was like, everyone's family's like this,
Yeah, right.
this
Yeah.
happens, right? So
What are you talking about?
minimization,
I had a good
denial.
childhood. Yeah.
Well, I knew in a lot of ways, yes, but then I knew there were certain things where I was like, this was a cry for help, or I wasn't, I could look
Sure.
back and see things, but I don't think I was able to really note the level of dysfunction because somehow I was able to see certain things like enabling. Like I kind of knew what enabling looked like. I don't know how I did. I just sort of did. And I remember when I got married when I just turned 20. I had gotten married. I was in the
Okay.
army.
Yeah.
And we eloped in Vegas in the oldest church in Las Vegas called We Kirk of the Heather. And if you're familiar, it was in a movie and it had like flying small people in it, which is like Elvis impersonators and like small people, but it wasn't like that. It was just a very quaint church. So they kind of like pumped it up for the movie with, I forget, it was like a movie with Catherine Zeta-Jones. Anyway, I'm digressing. But after we got married, I actually met his family after, because we sort of decided to get married to do the Army married couples program. So we're like, let's just do it. We were going to get married anyway in 6 months. Let's get married now so we can get orders together and be together. Because
Hmm.
we had a feeling we were both going to be assigned to Korea. And I'm trying to remember when we got those orders or how that worked. Maybe we had them already. I don't know. But anyway, I could already see the different dynamics of enabling and things like that and
Okay.
dysfunction, but I didn't know how it applied to me.
Okay.
And I was like, okay, I'm seeing this. And then in our marriage, I remember kind of this feeling of like being joined at the hip a lot, or even feeling like, well, we should be doing all these things together. Like we're supposed to be together as much as possible, kind of
Okay.
thing,
Yeah.
which I feel like was sort of modeling some of these like more anxious emotions that I was picking up on from my mom, and kind of
Sure.
modeling those.
Right.
And just like some of those dynamics around like the same dynamics around like lack of boundaries, and kind of feeling a sense of entitlement of like around his time or his resources or certain things. And I'm trying to remember on the other side. I mean, it was kind of similar. It was kind of like that in different ways. Like he expected us to financially support his family, like his mom, his sister, his brothers, with like no questions asked when they weren't doing anything to really provide for themselves. But when I asked about it, he would like get really upset with me and say I was being cruel.
Hmm.
So it was just kind of interesting where there was just like a lot of intersection of these blind spots. Um, and then coming out of that and just being like, at the time when my marriage was dissolving, it was like the worst thing in the world. Like I felt like I couldn't breathe, and I didn't know how I was like going to survive, or even like maybe
Right.
some of the shame around being divorced and being the only divorced sibling and all
Right.
of the meaning, blah 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 blah. What does
Right.
it
Right.
mean to be a
Right.
divorced woman? Blah, blah, blah. But then after that, I was like, oh my God, this was the best thing ever, because we were really ill suited for each other. Like I have a love of travel. He just had other things.
Right.
We just, and it worked for a time. And really, like he had a very enmeshed relationship with his mother as well. And there
Right.
was also like
I'll
in
take
his
care of you.
family, the dad was the bad guy, so he's similar, like kind of aggressor. Or
Right.
like I think in his case, I think his dad had moved away or they separated, and then the dad got into a new relationship, or maybe was cheating and then just left and whatever. But a lot of like vilification of, I don't know if that's a word or not, of his dad. So there were just certain similar dynamics of like him wanting to rescue his mother
Right.
and me wanting to rescue my mother, and this like martyrdom thing with our mothers, and very codependent
Right.
family
Yeah.
stuff, all kinds of financial enmeshment, emotional enmeshment, like we're
Right.
all responsible, we're
Right.
better, like we're good, so we need to help
Yeah.
them kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oof.
So
What a
so
twisted web we weave.
so divorce was actually a really beautiful thing, and
But it's
yeah, it
interesting
helped
to
me.
hear about how, because like I don't know how you could separate it out. There's so many dynamics that sort of get
Mhm.
fired up, and then you put yourself into a new system, and then you spin up, and then like like these little sprites fire off, and you sort of enter into the system and become this thing. With these railroad guides of how you were habituated and like the world that you know.
Right.
But none of this happens consciously, right?
No, no.
No, there's all sorts of things that are happening, tons of things that are happening, none of it consciously, right?
Well, what was interesting is in that first marriage, there was so much like betrayal and lying and like cheating kind of things. Maybe not like full force, but there was enough of
Yeah.
many incidents of that. And I feel like I was potentially the more enabled one in some situations. Like
Mm.
I'm trying to like look at it clearly, like perhaps emotionally enabled or being caretaked, like taken care of in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But then after, so we separated and then we were getting a divorce. I ended up in another relationship like 6 months later. And I really feel like I pivoted into the other role of being the rescuer
Mm.
and being the enabler. But like then enabling becomes very sneaky and tricky.
Right.
So it's like when like if the modeling that you've seen, there's an imbalance of power in some way, and you have someone that's like the rescuer, the hero, then you have someone in the one down position, you have
The
them in the one up
victim.
position, right? So you will find yourself flip flopping in
Right.
relationships, which is what
Uh-huh.
I found myself doing, flip flopping.
Yeah.
And then, so I felt like those dynamics were kind of maybe modeling like both my parents, but it
Sure.
also felt like the safer dynamic to play out those roles was like my mother dynamic. So to play the role of my mother and be somewhat emotionally dependent and needing to be rescued and needing to help. And although I never really identified with it because I was, you know, at 25, I was getting close to making what 6 figures a year, like at, bought a $500,000 home. So I don't think I felt or looked helpless, I'm
Right.
using lots of air quotes for people who can't see. Like I don't think I felt helpless, but on some level, like emotionally, I felt
Sure.
completely dependent, and my own sense of self-worth was so easily, like it was so easy that that could be obliterated by
Mm-hmm.
his either wanting me or not wanting me, or
Right.
how things were going. And then as I evolved in my relationships, so initially, I don't know if I've ever spoken about this, but initially I found that I was more satisfied with not being as attracted, like physically. So I was more interested, so I said, in like personality and just, caring about the inside of a person. And I really felt like some of those dynamics, this was from different layers of trauma, but also me enacting a lot of a safer, more familiar dynamic that I had with my mother, because my attachment style, I would have definitely classified as, and I, when I first started testing, my attachment style would come out as fearful avoidant, because my dad was very scary.
Mm-hmm.
And even looking back, there were things about my mother that felt unsafe. So my caretakers were both a sense of safety and a sense of deep fear of
Right.
being hurt in some
Yeah.
way. Um, and most of that was like psychological intimidation and stuff like that. So not like directly physical, but it still actually takes the same toll. So anyone
Yeah.
who's interested in like looking at that dynamic, I would recommend watching Maid on Netflix, because she's never hit and she doesn't realize she's a battered woman. So it's kind of like that dynamic was a similar thing, because my
Right.
grandmother went through that. She was never hit, but she
Mm-hmm.
had all the signs of having that deep trauma.
Right.
And in some cases, they say it's worse if you witness it, but you don't have the wounds or the
Yeah.
scars to like, you
Point
know,
at.
right, know where to say this happened to me, right?
Yeah.
Um, but what I ended up doing is later when I moved to New York, I decided that I was going to date men that I was actually very attracted to, which was not something I allowed myself to do for quite some time.
Yeah.
And it was so dysregulating. And I think it was because then I started tapping into confronting some of this fear that I had with my father dynamics. And not to say that, like this is all very Freudian, like repetition compulsion, but my nervous system understanding like relationship of what masculine energy was like to me, or what my neural expectation was for like that kind of bond. Right. Does that make sense what I'm
Well,
saying?
I also think about it's you entering into the victim triangle on the, on the healer part. Like you're needed, right? And when you enter into, when you enter into something and you're not in the one-up position, of being, of being, well, you obviously need me because, uh,
Mm-hmm.
right, I'm in the one-up there.
Yeah,
It
so
just
yeah,
upsets the balance, right?
I would say yeah, my earlier dynamics were, well, I would have said my marriage was very counter dependent. So an avoidant mask over anxiousness.
Right.
Then I would say my next relationship was still in the counter dependent realm, but I was still kind of like a co rescuer in my first relationship,
Mm-hmm.
not understanding those dynamics, and then also receiving some enabling in some ways.
Right.
In my second major relationship, being more of an enabler. Then as I moved into these other relationships, the power dynamics did change. And it was also me like fully taking a risk to step into my anxiousness. And
Mm-hmm.
that was like an entirely different thing.
Yeah.
So that was wild, like stuff I had
Uh-huh.
never felt before. I
Yeah.
didn't know was there. The amount of rage and
Uh,
entitlement and revenge and just
yeah.
like it was totally
Crazy town.
wild.
Yeah.
And it was very challenging, but I will say one of the best things, and I feel like I got very lucky and had some support, but one of my good friends, she's like I think 13ish years older than me, 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
She had been doing therapy for such a long time, so she would be able to be like, Angela, like, did he really do that? Are you interpreting it this way? And I'd be like,
Right.
you're right. And so I really did my best to not like burn the whole thing to the ground, but I wanted to repeatedly.
Sure.
So what I always did was I tried to step back and do my own processing so I wouldn't burn it to the ground.
Yeah.
And then I would do my best. And then when I felt good to approach, then I would do that. But then I also started getting therapy, and that's when I started hiring coaches and stuff. So I started heavily investing in the work at that point because anxiousness, that anxious attachment style, is so crazy challenging to deal with on your own.
Yeah. It's a
It feels
thorn in
like
the side for
feels
sure.
like dying.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, anyway, I will say that anyone who has an insecure attachment style, I feel like to some level there's going to be some form of enmeshment there. And I think that can be on a spectrum,
Absolutely.
if you think about it, because when you have complex trauma, like a lot of that comes from boundary violations where it's like they were little to no boundaries or no, individuation or independence or interdependence wasn't really encouraged. It was all
Right.
about like the needs of this person or everyone being in agreement kind of thing, group thinking, whatever, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So there's
Right.
just, it's just very layered. But I would say anyone that has a lot of trauma in their background to some degree will probably experience or have had experienced some level of parentification or enmeshment.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Yeah. But that's just my opinion.
Is that enough for today? Podcast 23?
I think so. I don't even know how long we've been talking, but
I'm guessing about 70 minutes.
yeah, that's good.
Okay, cool. All right, check out our socials. Come say hi, leave us a comment. We'll talk about whatever you want to talk about because that's what we do. We talk about shit. So, anyway, So Emotional Podcast. My name's Nick. This is Angela. And that
Yeah.
was, what did you talk about? Enmeshment,
Yeah.
parentification.
Enmeshment, parentification.
All
A bunch
right.
of other things there too.
Over and out.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Later.